Few places on Earth experience the land loss that we see in coastal Louisiana every day. This was the coast in 1932. And here is what scientists warn it will look like by 2050 unless something is done to stop the land from melting away. A sea of red. 2,000 square miles, an area the size of Delaware, vanished. The Mississippi River, locked in a straitjacket of levees, no longer nourishes the delta. Oil and gas canals serve as veins of salt water gnawing at the marsh. And much of the land subsides. It simply sinks under the surface of the Gulf. This color-coded map shows where land disappeared over certain periods of time. For example, this purple area here shows the huge swath of land that was washed away in Hurricane Katrina in Breton Sound. Against all those negative forces, there are places where land has been restored. Along the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, east of the Twin Spans, a dredge carves away at the lake bottom. And a pipe delivers another type of black gold, mud that has pieced back together 600 acres of shoreline wiped out in Katrina.
For future storms and so forth that might, God forbid, come into this area, that we needed that protection.
The land comes courtesy of QIPRA, a state and federal program that built some of the very first coastal projects 30 years ago. Over time, QIPRA has built 210 projects. We hear about barrier islands as the first line of defense. A lot more work has been done to piece them back together than you might realize. For example, 30 miles of these ribbons of sand have been restored from the mouth of the Mississippi River all the way over to Port Fourchon. Imagine 30 superdomes worth of sand pumped onto islands that were in danger of disintegrating. Fines and penalties from the 2010 Gulf oil spill paid for the most recent work.
Now we've got a major speed bump for any sort of storm surge that comes through.
Back to the color-coded map. A few areas in green actually depict where land has been added since 1932. For example, these areas near the mouth of the Mississippi River. Dredging projects built some land instantly. In other places, it took decades. In those few spots where the river runs free of levees, it dumps sediment in a more natural process. In Cubit's Gap on the east bank of Plaquemines Parish, the river has steadily been building real estate since the 1870s.
We can actually build more resilient wetlands using the river, using the sediments in the river to build wetlands and sustain the wetlands that we have into the future.
We find the most dramatic example south of Morgan City, dredging projects here at the mouth of the Atchafalaya River, and then to the west of that, this artificial channel. From space, you can spot an accidental delta. The Army Corps dug the Wax Lake Outlet in the 1940s, a shortcut from the Atchafalaya River to the Gulf. It was designed to spare Morgan City from flooding. By the late 70s, river sand and mud had converted open water to land.
And when you feel it, you can feel the silt and you can feel that particles that are in this landscape that help build this land.
The state's coastal master plan envisions a combination of river diversions and dredging projects to put more green on that color-coded map. Despite their ambitious plans, state officials concede they can only slow the rate of land loss. They have managed, though, to stitch back together some of these vital defenses. John Snell, Fox 8 News. Spring and early summer bring to South Louisiana a population explosion. From ravenously hungry mockingbird chicks to spoonbills that dot cypress trees like pink tree ornaments. And this little guy, who doesn't know it, but he's out of place. His parents should be in a swamp or marsh. But by the dozens, they've taken up residence in oak trees along a street in Algiers.
They all look like Albert Einstein, and they're crazy. They just fly all over the place.
Holy Cross professor Peter Yockey gets all kinds of questions from people about these yellow-crowned night herons.
They're all excited because they've seen this crazy-looking bird in their yard, right? It seems like it ought to be in Africa or something, right? Or the Amazon.
When they're healthy, they eat like pit bulls. You just put a bowl of food in front of them and they eat like they're crazy when they're hungry.
Patty and Tim Mack ought to know. Over the last few years, they've rescued several of the birds that fell from nest, even feeding them crawfish and shrimp.
When I walk out in the yard, I get these birds that run at me, squawking and chirping.
They think he's their mom.
And it's really quite an experience, especially as they get big. They're a lot friendlier when they're hungry.
It's kind of amazing that they moved into the city, and we should protect them.
Bird lovers want to get the word out about the vulnerable chicks.
And it's pretty fun having herons in the yard.
He calls, they come. Oh, he's flying back up. Oh, good, good, good. Very good. Oh, great. Very good.
Not every ending is a happy one. Last year, a study by the National Audubon Society found that 30% of North America's bird species are in decline, some of them crashing.
The species we see in numbers in urban areas are those that are amenable to urbanization.
Roseate spoonbills were once creatures of remote islands and swamps. They now frequently show up in drainage canals in metro New Orleans, a species once knocking on extinction's doorstep.
The roseate spoonbill has a tragic history of having been persecuted for its feathers, for fashion decorations, 100 years ago, and it's come back from that.
Despite the success here, the bird's numbers are falling dramatically in Florida.
Oh, he got them wings out, one in the back.
Louisiana is now also a hot spot for bald eagles. State biologists count more than 300 nesting pairs statewide.
I know of 4 nests in the developed part of the city this year, up from just 2 last year.
But you don't have to travel very far back in history to know that this success is relative.
If you look back to Audubon's time, there were stunning amounts of wildlife in Louisiana.
David Muth of the National Wildlife Federation points out that when the first Europeans arrived in coastal Louisiana, wildlife numbers were staggering. Birds blackened the skies.
The first Europeans that arrived in Louisiana, and the few that left accounts, just describe a world that we can't even envision now.
By the 1970s, scientists said the use of the pesticide DDT had virtually extinguished the Louisiana brown pelican. The population has come roaring back, but experts say the forces grinding away at Louisiana's coast could put new pressures on the pelican.
We can't help but look at them as threatened in a more long-term sense.
Environmentalists see hope in the Mississippi River, turning the river loose in strategic places to build or sustain land.
We actually have the opportunity to bring some of it back.
In the meantime, some feathered friends aren't waiting on man to decide where they ought to live. John Snell, Fox 8 News. Down the Wilkinson Canal in Plaquemines Parish, a slice of Louisiana life. Camp homes on ever more isolated pieces of property. Near Barataria Bay, white pelicans, south for the winter, find a rest stop. But out in the bay itself, David Silv's GPS has trouble keeping pace with the land loss.
My GPS telling me we're at 4 feet of water, and all the brown spot that you see on the GPS used to be land.
It tells him he is smack dab in the middle of an island in Cat Bay.
Now there's no more land. It is just all open water.
And it's astonishing how quickly it happened. The islands of Cat Bay were ground zero in the 2010 Gulf oil spill. The Plaquemines Parish government said mangrove trees, the glue that held the islands together, soaked in crude. It's also true that the islands were steadily shrinking long before the blowout. A single PVC pipe today marks the edge of an island.
That's land right there.
P.J. Hahn served as Plaquemines coastal director during the spill.
3.5 feet over a period of 1 year.
As more land disappears in Barataria Bay, storms and everyday tides move more and more water across the islands. Each wave takes a bite out of the shoreline.
This would have been lush sand depending on when. I mean, we were out here 7 years ago when we first started following this island, and it had lush 8-foot mangroves covering the island.
A few miles away, we find the last remaining island in Cat Bay. Pelicans cling to a mound of shells. In mid-tide, it measures smaller than a basketball court. We know from past experience here in Cat Bay that this island is in the final stages of life. What will happen is the waves will push up these shells into a mound. The island actually gains elevation before the waves come and wash it all away. We find only the skeletal remains of a few mangroves and patches of grass.
It's like getting punched in the gut when you come out here and you see how fast this land is disappearing. By next year, all of this land will be gone.
Here was yet another island we followed. 3 years ago, it barely snaked above the surface, a ribbon of sand and shells. Now, it's gone altogether. This third island, again, is a mound of shells. It's a little closer to the end because it's a little softer here. This was 3-4 acres 7 years ago. The Louisiana Delta was always in transition. As the Mississippi River changed course over thousands of years, new land formed, but land eroded in other places. Those remnant shorelines turned into islands, and as they became more isolated, ideal spots for pelicans and other birds.
The island needs to be isolated enough that it doesn't have predators visiting all the time. It needs to be small enough that it can't support predators, and I'm talking about raccoons, I'm talking about coyotes principally.
Cat Bay made for a pelican paradise precisely because it became isolated as the land disappeared. The problem, the Mississippi River, contained within its levees, no longer builds new land. It no longer replaces those eroding and sinking islands.
Where we had hundreds and hundreds of potentially suitable islands, the number is just decreasing all the time.
As what used to be 30 different bays in Barataria Bay becomes one giant bay, David Muth of the National Wildlife Federation says the opportunity for those birds to find the ideal nesting spot goes away.
It's an open question. Are we going to have to, in the end, have nothing but man-made islands or man-maintained islands like Queen Bess in order for them to nest?
In the meantime, the birds latch on to whatever sliver of sand or piling they can find.
Those were pretty much birds from Cat Island that were here probably 2 years ago, that were hatched 2 years ago.
Wildlife biologists say brown pelicans imprint on the island of their birth. They want to nest there.
And it's not like they'll go off and breed somewhere and nest somewhere else. They just stop breeding and stop nesting.
The brown pelican stands as one of conservation's great success stories, brought back from the verge of extinction. But along Louisiana's coast, the pelican steadily runs out of real estate. John Snell, Fox 8 News.